George sat silent. He looked at the empty bottle and the empty glasses. "It's hell, isn't it?" he said. "No, not exactly," Nick said. "Why not?" "I don't know," Nick said. "Will you ever go skiing together in the States?" George said. "I don't know," said Nick. "The mountains aren't much," George said. "No," said Nick. "They're too rocky. There's too much timber, and they're too far away." "Yes," said George, "that's the way it is in California." "Yes," Nick said, "that's the way it is everywhere I've ever been." "Yes," said George, "that's the way it is." The Swiss got up and paid and went out. "I wish we were Swiss," George said. "They've all got goiter," said Nick. "I don't believe it," George said. "Neither do I," said Nick. They laughed. "Maybe we'll never go skiing again, Nick," George said. "We've got to," said Nick. "It isn't worthwhile if you can't." "We'll go all right," George said. "We've got to," Nick agreed. "I wish we could make a promise about it," George said. Nick stood up. He buckled his wind jacket tight. He leaned over George and picked up the 2 ski poles from against the wall. He stuck one of the ski poles into the floor. "There isn't any good in promising," he said. They opened the door and went out. It was very cold. The snow had crusted hard. The road ran up the hill into the pine trees. They took down their skis from where they leaned against the wall in the inn. Nick put on his gloves. George was already started up the road, his skis on his shoulder. Now they would have the run home together. Chapter 13. I heard the drums coming down the street, and then the fifes and the pipes, and then they came around the corner, all dancing. The street was full of them. Maera saw him, and then I saw him. When they stopped the music for the crouch, he hunched down in the street with them all, and when they started it again, he jumped up and went dancing down the street with them. He was drunk, all right. "You go down after him," said Maera. "He hates me." So I went down and caught up with them and grabbed him while he was crouched down, waiting for the music to break loose, and said, "Come on, Luis. For Christ's sake, you've got bulls this afternoon." He didn't listen to me. He was listening so hard for the music to start. I said, "Don't be a damn fool, Luis. Come on back to the hotel." Then the music started up again, and he jumped up and twisted away from me and started dancing. I grabbed his arm, and he pulled loose and said, "Oh, leave me alone. You're not my father." I went back to the hotel, and Maera was on the balcony, looking out to see if I'd be bringing him back. He went inside when he saw me and came downstairs disgusted. "Well," I said, "after all, he's just an ignorant Mexican savage." "Yes," Maera said, "and who will kill his bulls after he gets a corrida?" "We, I suppose," I said. "Yes, we," said Maera. "We kills the savages' bulls, and the drunkards' bulls, and the riau-riau dancers' bulls. Yes, we kill them. We kill them all right. Yes, yes, yes." My old man. I guess, looking at it now, my old man was cut out for a fat guy, one of those regular little roly fat guys you see around. But he sure never got that way, except a little toward the last, and then it wasn't his fault. He was riding over the jumps only, and he could afford to carry plenty of weight then. I remember the way he'd pull on a rubber shirt over a couple of jerseys and a big sweatshirt over that and get me to run with him in the forenoon in the hot sun. He'd have maybe taken a trial trip with one of Razzo's skins early in the morning after just getting in from Torino at 4 o'clock in the morning and beating it out to the stables in a cab, and then with the dew all over everything and the sun just starting to get going, I'd help him pull off his boots, and he'd get into a pair of sneakers and all these sweaters, and we'd start out. "Come on, kid," he'd say, stepping up and down on his toes in front of the jock's dressing room. "Let's get moving." Then we'd start off jogging around the infield once, maybe, with him ahead, running nice, and then turn out the gate and along one of the roads with all the trees along both sides of them that run out from San Siro. I'd go ahead of him when we hit the road, and I could run pretty good, and I'd look around, and he'd be jogging easy just behind me, and after a little while I'd look around again, and he'd begun to sweating heavy, and he'd just be dogging it along with his eyes on my back. But when he'd catch me looking at him, he'd grin and say, "Sweating plenty?" When my old man grinned, nobody could help but grin too. We'd keep right on running out toward the mountains, and then my old man would yell, "Hey, Joe!" And I'd look back, and he'd be sitting under a tree with a towel he'd had around his waist wrapped around his neck. I'd come back and sit down beside him, and he'd pull a rope out of his pocket and start skipping rope out in the sun, with the sweat pouring off his face, and him skipping rope out in the white dust with the rope going cloppity-cloppity, clop, 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 and the sun hotter, and him working harder up and down a patch of the road. Say, it was a treat to see my old man skip rope, too. He could whir it fast or lop it slow and fancy. Say, you ought to have seen wops look at us sometimes when they'd come by, going into town, walking along with big white steers hauling the cart. They sure looked as though they thought the old man was nuts. He'd start the rope whirring till they'd stopped dead still and watch him, then give the steers a cluck and a poke with the goad and get going again. When I'd sit watching him, working out in the hot sun, I sure felt fond of him. He sure was fun, and he done his work so hard, and he finished up with a regular whirring that'd drive the sweat out on his face like water, and then sling the rope at the tree, and come over and sit down with me and lean back against the tree with the towel and a sweater wrapped around his neck. "Sure as hell keeping it down, Joe," he'd say, and lean back and shut his eyes and breathe long and deep. "It ain't like when you're a kid." Then he'd get up, and before he started to cool, we'd jog along back to the stables. That's the way it was, keeping down to weight. He was worried all the time. Most jocks can just about ride off all they want to. A jock loses about a kilo every time he rides. But my old man was sort of dried out, and he couldn't keep down his kilos without all that running. I remember once at San Siro, Regoli, a little wop that was riding for Buzzoni, came out across the paddock going to the bar for something cool, and flicking his boots with his whip after he'd just weighed in. And my old man had just weighed in, too, and came out with the saddle under his arm, looking red-faced and tired, and too big for his silks. And he stood there looking at young Regoli, standing up to the outdoors bar, cool and kid-looking. And I said, "What's the matter, Dad?" 'cause I thought maybe Regoli had bumped him or something. And he just looked at Regoli and said, "Oh, to hell with it," and went on to the dressing room. Well, it would have been all right, maybe, if we'd stayed in Milan and ridden at Milan and Torino. 'Cause if there were ever any easy courses, it's those two. "Pianola, Joe," my old man said when he dismounted in the winning stall after what the wops thought was a hell of It's the pace you're going at that makes riding the jumps dangerous, Joe. We ain't going any pace here, and they ain't really bad jumps either. But it's the pace always, not the jumps, that makes the trouble. San Siro was the swellest course I'd ever seen, but the old man said it was a dog's life, going back and forth between Mirafiore and San Siro, and riding just about every day in the week with a train ride every other night. I was nuts about the horses, too. There's something about it when they come out and go up the track to the post, sort of dancy and tight-looking, with the jock keeping a tight hold on them and maybe easing off a little and letting them run a little going up. Then, once they were at the barrier, it got me worse than anything, especially at San Siro, with that big green infield and the mountains way off, and the fat wop starter with his big whip and the jocks fiddling them around, and then the barrier snapping up and that bell going off and them all getting off in a bunch and then commencing to string out. You know the way a bunch of skins gets off. If you're up in the stand with a pair of glasses, all you see is them plunging off, and then that bell goes off and it seems like it rings for 1,000 years, and then they come sweeping round the turn. There wasn't ever anything like it for me. But my old man said one day in the dressing room when he was getting into his street clothes, "None of these things are horses, Joe. They'd kill that bunch of skates for their hides and hoofs up at Paris." That was the day he'd won the Premio Commercio, with Lantorna shooting out of the field the last 100 meters, like pulling a cork out of a bottle. It was right after the Premio Commercio that we pulled out and left Italy. My old man and Holbrook and a fat wop in a straw hat that kept wiping his face with a handkerchief were having an argument at a table in the Galleria. They were all talking French, and the two of them was after my old man about something. Finally, he didn't say anything anymore, but just sat there and looked at Holbrook, and the two of them kept after him, first one talking and then the other, and the fat wop always butting in on Holbrook. "You go out and buy me a Sportsman, will you, Joe?" my old man said, and handed me a couple of soldi without looking away from Holbrook. So I went out of the Galleria and walked over to in front of the Scala and bought a paper and came back and stood a little way away because I didn't want to butt in, and my old man was sitting back in his chair looking down at his coffee and fooling with a spoon, and Holbrook and the big wop were standing, and the big wop was wiping his face and shaking his head. And I came up, and my old man acted just as though the two of them weren't standing there, and said, "Want an ice, Joe?" Holbrook looked down at my old man and said, slow and careful, "You son of a bitch." And he and the fat wop went out through the tables. My old man sat there and sort of smiled at me, but his face was white, and he looked sick as hell. And I was scared and felt sick inside because I knew something had happened, and I didn't see how anybody could call my old man a son of a bitch and get away with it. My old man opened up the Sportsman and studied the handicaps for a while, and then he said, "You gotta take a lot of things in this world, Joe." And 3 days later we left Milan for good on the Turin train for Paris, after an auction sale out in front of Turner's stables of everything we couldn't get into a trunk and a suitcase. We got into Paris early in the morning in a long, dirty station the old man told me was the Gare de Lyon. Paris was an awful big town after Milan. Seems like in Milan everyone is going somewhere and all the trams run somewhere, and there ain't any sort of a mix-up. But Paris is all balled up, and they never do straighten it out. I got to like it, though, part of it anyway. And say, it's got the best racecourses in the world. Seems as though that were the thing that keeps it all going, and about the only thing you can figure on is that every day The buses will be going out to whatever track they're running at, going right out through everything to the track. I never really got to know Paris well because I just came in about once or twice a week with the old man from Maison, and he always sat at the Café de la Paix on the Opera side with the rest of the gang from Maison, and I guess that's one of the busiest parts of the town. But say, it is funny that a big town like Paris wouldn't have a galleria, isn't it? Well, we went out to live at Maison Lafitte, where just about everybody lives except the gang at Chantilly, with a Mrs. Myers that runs a boarding house. Maison is about the swellest place to live I've ever seen in all my life. The town ain't so much, but there's a lake and a swell forest that we used to go off bumming in all day, a couple of us kids. And my old man made me a slingshot, and we got a lot of things with it, but the best one was a magpie. Young Dick Atkinson shot a rabbit with it one day, and we put it under a tree, and we're all sitting around, and Dick had some cigarettes, and all of a sudden the rabbit jumped up and beat it into the brush, and we chased it, but we couldn't find it. Gee, we had fun at Maison. Mrs. Myers used to give me lunch in the morning, and I'd be gone all day. I learned to talk French quick. It's an easy language. As soon as we got to Maison, my old man wrote to Milan for his license, and he was pretty worried till it came. He used to sit around the Café du Paris in Maison with the gang. There were lots of guys he'd known when he'd rode up at Paris before the war, lived at Maison. And there's a lot of time to sit around because the work around a racing stable, for the jocks that is all cleaned up by 9 o'clock in the morning. They take the first bunch of skins out to gallop them at 5:30 in the morning, and they work the second lot at 8 o'clock. That means getting up early, all right, and going to bed early, too. If a jock's riding for somebody, too, he can't go boozing around because the trainer always has an eye on him if he's a kid, and if he ain't a kid, he's always got an eye on himself. So mostly, if a jock ain't working, he sits around the Café de Paris with the gang, and they can all sit around about 2 or 3 hours in front of some drink, like a vermouth and seltz, and they talk and tell stories and shoot pool, and it's sort of like a club, or the Galleria in Milan. Only it ain't really like the Galleria, because there everybody is going by all the time, and there's everybody around at the tables. Well, my old man got his license all right. They sent it through to him without a word, and he rode a couple of times. Amiens, up country, and that sort of thing, but he didn't seem to get any engagement. Everybody liked him, and whenever I'd come into the cafe in the forenoon, I'd find somebody drinking with him, because my old man wasn't tight like most of these jockeys that have got the first dollar they made riding at the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. That's what my old man would say when he'd kid George Burns. But it seemed like everybody steered clear of giving my old man any mounts. We went out to wherever they were running every day with the car from Maison, and that was the most fun of all. I was glad when the horses came back from Deauville and the summer, even though it meant no more bumming in the woods, 'cause then we'd ride to Enghien or Tremblay or Saint-Cloud and watch them from the trainers' and jockeys' stand. I sure learned about racing from going out with that gang, and the fun of it was going every day. I remember once out at Saint-Cloud, it was a big 200,000-franc race with 7 entries and Khazar, a big favorite. I went around to the paddock to see the horses with my old man, and you never saw such horses. This Khazar is a great big yellow horse that looks like just nothing but run. I never saw such a horse. He was being led around the paddocks with his head down, and when he went by me, I felt all hollow inside. He was so beautiful. There never was such a wonderful, lean, running-built horse. And he went around the paddock, putting his feet just so, and quiet and careful, and moving easy like he knew just what he had to do, and not jerking and standing up on his legs and getting wild-eyed, like you see these selling platers with a shot of dope in them. The crowd was so thick I couldn't see him again, except just his legs going by and some yellow, and my old man started out through the crowd, and I followed him over to the jock's dressing room back in the trees. And there was a big crowd around there, too. But the man at the door in a derby nodded to my old man, and we got in, and everybody was sitting around and getting dressed and pulling shirts over their heads and pulling boots on, and it all smelled hot and sweaty and linamenty, and outside was the crowd looking in. The old man went over and sat down beside George Gardner, that was getting into his pants, and said, "What's the dope, George?" just in an ordinary tone of voice, 'cause there ain't any use him feeling around, because George either can tell him or he can't tell him. "He won't win," George says very low, leaning over and buttoning the bottoms of his breeches. "Who will?" my old man says, leaning over close so nobody can hear. "Kirkcudbright," George says, "and if he does, save me a couple of tickets." My old man says something in a regular voice to George, and George says, "Don't ever bet on anything I tell you," kidding-like. And we beat it out and threw all the crowd that was looking in over to the 100-franc mutual machine. But I knew something big was up because George is Khazar's jockey. On the way, he gets one of the yellow odds sheets with the starting prices on, and Khazar is only paying 5 for 10. Sophizidote is next at 3-1, and fifth down the list, this Kirkcudbright at 8-1. My old man bets 5,000 on Kirkcudbright to win, and puts on 1,000 to place, and we went around back of the grandstand to go up the stairs and get a place to watch the race. We were jammed in tight, and first a man in a long coat with a gray tall hat and a whip folded up in his hand came out, and then one after another the horses, with the jocks up and a stable boy holding the bridle on each side and walking along, followed the old guy. That big yellow horse Khazar came first. He didn't look so big when you first looked at him until you saw the length of his legs and the whole way he's built and the way he moves. Gosh, I never saw such a horse. George Gardner was riding him, and they moved along slow, back of the old guy in the gray tall hat that walked along like he was a ringmaster in a circus. Back of Khazar, moving along smooth and yellow in the sun, was a good-looking black with a nice head, with Tommy Archibald riding him. And after the black was a string of 5 more horses, all moving along slow in a procession, past the grandstand and the passage. My old man said the black was Kirkcudbright, and I took a good look at him, and he was a nice-looking horse all right, but nothing like Khazar. Everybody cheered Khazar when he went by, and he sure was one swell-looking horse. The procession of them went around on the other side, past the Palouse, and then back up to the near end of the course, and the circus master had the stable boys turn them loose, one after another, so they could gallop by the stands on their way up to the post and let everybody have a good look at them. They weren't at the post hardly any time at all when the gong started, and you could see them way off across the infield, all in a bunch, starting on the first swing like a lot of little toy horses. I was watching them through the glasses, and Khazar was running well back, with one of the bays making the pace. They swept down and around, and came pounding past, and Khazar was way back when they passed us, and this Kirkhubbin horse in front and going smooth. Gee, it's awful when they go by you, and then you have to watch them go farther away and get smaller and smaller, and then all bunched up on the turns, and then come around towards into the stretch, and you feel like swearing and goddamning worse and worse. Finally, they made the last turn and came into the straightaway with this Kirkhubbin horse way out in front. Everybody was looking funny and saying, "Khazar," in a sort of a sick way, and them pounding nearer down the stretch. And then something came out of the pack right into my glasses like a horse-headed yellow streak, and everybody began to yell, "Khazar," as though they were crazy. Khazar came on faster than I'd ever seen anything in my life, and pulled up on Kirkhubbin that was going fast as any black horse could go, with the jock flogging hell out of him with the gad, and they were right dead neck and neck for a second. But Khazar seemed going about twice as fast with those great jumps and that head out. But it was while they were neck and neck that they passed the winning post, and when the numbers went up in the slots, the first one was 2, and that meant that Kirkhubbin had won. I felt all trembly and funny inside, and then we were all jammed in with the people going downstairs to stand in front of the board where they'd post what Kirkhubbin paid. Honest, watching the race, I'd forgot how much my old man had bet on Kirkhubbin. I'd wanted Khazar to win so damned bad. But now it was all over. It was swell to know we had the winner. "Wasn't it a swell race, Dad?" I said to him. He looked at me sort of funny with his derby on the back of his head. "George Gardner's a swell jockey, all right," he said. "It sure took a great jock to keep that Khazar horse from winning." Of course, I knew it was funny all the time. But my old man saying that right out like that sure took the kick all out of it for me. And I didn't get the real kick back again ever. Even when they posted the numbers upon the board and the bell rang to pay off, and we saw that Kirkhubbin paid $67.50 for 10. All round, people were saying, "Poor Khazar, poor Khazar." And I thought, I wish I were a jockey and could have rode him instead of that son of a bitch. And that was funny, thinking of George Gardner as a son of a bitch, because I'd always liked him. And besides, he'd given us the winner. But I guess that's what he is, all right. My old man had a big lot of money after that race, and he took to coming into Paris oftener. If they raced at Tremblay, he'd have them drop him in town on their way back to Maison, and he and I'd sit out in front of the Café de la Paix and watch the people go by. It's funny sitting there. There's streams of people going by, and all sorts of guys come up and want to sell you things, and I loved to sit there with my old man. That was when we'd have the most fun. Guys would come by selling funny rabbits that jumped if you squeezed a bulb, and they'd come up to us, and my old man would kid with them. He could talk French just like English, and all those kind of guys knew him, 'cause you can always tell a jockey. And then we always sat at the same table, and they got used to seeing us there. There were guys selling matrimonial papers, and girls selling rubber eggs that when you squeezed them a rooster came out of them, and one old wormy-looking guy that went by with postcards of Paris, showing them to everybody, and of course nobody ever bought any, and then he would come back and show the underside of the pack, and they would all be smutty postcards, and lots of people would dig down and buy them. Gee, I remember the funny people that used to go by. Girls around supper time looking for somebody to take them out to eat, and they'd speak to me and my old man, and he'd make some joke at them in French, and they'd pat me on the head and go on. Once there was an American woman sitting with her kid daughter at the next table to us, and they were both eating ices, and I kept looking at the girl, and she was awfully good-looking, and I smiled at her, and she smiled at me. But that was all that ever came of it, because I looked for her mother and her every day, and I made up ways that I was going to speak to her, and I wondered, if I got to know her, if her mother would let me take her out to Auteuil or Tremblay, but I never saw either of them again. Anyway, I guess it wouldn't have been any good anyway, because, looking back on it, I remember the way I thought out would be best to speak to her was to say, "Pardon me, but perhaps I can give you a winner at Enghien today." And, after all, maybe she would have thought I was a tout instead of really trying to give her a winner. We'd sit at the Café de la Paix, my old man and me, and we had a big drag with the waiter because my old man drank whiskey and it cost 5 francs, and that meant a good tip when the saucers were counted up. My old man was drinking more than I'd ever seen him, but he wasn't riding at all now, and besides he said that whiskey kept his weight down. But I noticed he was putting it on all right, just the same. He'd busted away from his old gang out at Maison, and seemed to like just sitting round on the boulevard with me. But he was dropping money every day at the track. He'd feel sort of doleful after the last race if he'd lost on the day, until we'd get to our table, and then he'd have his first whiskey, and then he'd be fine. He'd be reading the Paris Sport, and he'd look over at me and say, "Where's your girl, Joe?" to kid me, on account I had told him about the girl that day at the next table. And I'd get red, but I liked being kidded about her. It gave me a good feeling. "Keep your eye peeled for her, Joe," he'd say. "She'll be back." He'd ask me questions about things, and some of the things I'd say, he'd laugh. And then he'd get started talking about things, about riding down in Egypt or at Saint Moritz, on the ice before my mother died, and about during the war when they had regular races down in the south of France without any purses or betting or crowd or anything, just to keep the breed up. Regular races with the jocks riding hell out of the horses. Gee, I could listen to my old man talk by the hour, especially when he'd had a couple or so of drinks. He'd tell me about when he was a boy in Kentucky and going coon hunting, and the old days in the States before everything went on the bum there, and he'd say, "Joe, when we've got a decent stake, you're going back there to the States and go to school." "What have I got to go back there to go to school for when everything's on the bum there?" I'd ask him. "That's different," he'd say, and get the waiter over and pay the pile of saucers, and we'd get a taxi to the Gare Saint-Lazare and get on the train out to Maison. One day at Auteuil, after a selling steeplechase, my old man bought in the winner for 30,000 francs. He had to bid a little to get him, but the stable let the horse go finally, and my old man had his permit and his colors in a week. Gee, I felt proud when my old man was an owner. He fixed it up for stable space with Charles Drake and cut out coming into Paris, and started his running and sweating out again, and him and I were the whole stable gang. Our horse's name was Guilford. He was Irish bred and a nice, sweet jumper. My old man figured that training him and riding him himself, he was a good investment. I was proud of everything, and I thought Guilford was as good a horse as Khazar. He was a good, solid jumper, a bay, with plenty of speed on the flat, if you asked him for it, and he was a nice-looking horse, too. Gee, I was fond of him. The first time he started with my old man up, he finished third in a 2,500-meter hurdle race, and when my old man got off him, all sweating and happy in the place stall, and went into weigh, I felt as proud of him as though it was the first race he'd ever placed in. You see, when a guy ain't been riding for a long time, you can't make yourself really believe that he has ever rode. The whole thing was different now, 'cause down in Milan, even big races never seemed to make any difference to my old man. If he won, he wasn't ever excited or anything. And now it was so I couldn't hardly sleep the night before a race, and I knew my old man was excited too, even if he didn't show it. Riding for yourself makes an awful difference. Second time Guilford and my old man started was a rainy Sunday at Auteuil in the Prix de Marat, a 4,500-meter steeplechase. As soon as he'd gone out, I beat it up in the stand with the new glasses my old man had bought for me to watch them. They started way over at the far end of the course, and there was some trouble at the barrier. Something with goggle blinders on was making a great fuss and rearing around and busted the barrier once, but I could see my old man in our black jacket with a white cross and a black cap sitting up on Guilford and patting him with his hand. Then they were off in a jump and out of sight behind the trees, and the gong going for dear life, and the pari-mutuel wickets rattling down. Gosh, I was so excited I was afraid to look at them. But I fixed the glasses on the place where they would come out back of the trees, and then out they came with the old black jacket going third, and they all sailing over the jump like birds. Then they went out of sight again, and then they came pounding out and down the hill, and all going nice and sweet and easy, and taking the fence smooth in a bunch and moving away from us all solid. Looked as though you could walk across on their backs, they were all so bunched and going so smooth. Then they bellied over the big double bullfinch, and something came down. I couldn't see who it was, but in a minute the horse was up and galloping free, and the field, all bunched still, sweeping around the long left turn into the straightaway. They jumped the stone wall and came jammed down the stretch toward the big water jump right in front of the stands. I saw them coming and hollered at my old man as he went by, and he was leading by about a length and riding way out and light as a monkey, and they were racing for the water jump. They took off over the big hedge of the water jump in a pack, and then there was a crash, and two horses pulled sideways out of it and kept on going, and three others were piled up. I couldn't see my old man anywhere. One horse kneed himself up, and the jock had hold of the bridle and mounted and went slamming on after the place money. The other horse was up and away by himself, jerking his head and galloping with the bridle rein hanging, and the jock staggered over to one side of the track against the fence. Then Guilford rolled over to one side, off my old man, and got up and started to run on three legs with his front off hoof dangling. And there was my old man, laying there on the grass, flat out with his face up, and blood all over the side of his head. I ran down the stand and bumped into a jam of people and got to the rail, and a cop grabbed me and held me, and two big stretcher-bearers were going out after my old man. And around on the other side of the course I saw three horses, strung way out, coming out of the trees and taking the jump. My old man was dead when they brought him in, and while a doctor was listening to his heart with a thing plugged in his ears, I heard a shot up the track that meant they'd killed Guilford. I lay down beside my old man when they carried the stretcher into the hospital room, and hung onto the stretcher and cried, and he looked so white and gone, and so awfully dead. And I couldn't help feeling that if my old man was dead, maybe they didn't need to have shot Guilford. His hoof might have got well, I don't know. I loved my old man so much. Then a couple of guys came in, and one of them patted me on the back, and then went over and looked at my old man, and then pulled a sheet off the cot and spread it over him. And the other was telephoning in French for them to send the ambulance and take him out to Maison. And I couldn't stop crying and choking, sort of. And George Gardner came in and sat down beside me on the floor and put his arm around me and says, "Come on, Joe, old boy. Get up and we'll go out and wait for the ambulance." George and I went out to the gate, and I was trying to stop bawling, and George wiped off my face with his handkerchief, and we were standing back a little ways while the crowd was going out of the gate, and a couple of guys stopped near us while we were waiting for the crowd to get through the gate, and one of them was counting a bunch of mutual tickets, and he said, "Well, Butler got his all right." The other guy said, "I don't give a good goddamn if he did, the crook. He had it coming to him on the stuff he's pulled." "I'll say he had," said the other guy, and tore the bunch of tickets in two. And George Gardner looked at me to see if I'd heard, and I had all right, and he said, "Don't you listen to what those bums said, Joe. Your old man was one swell guy." But I don't know. Seems like when they get started, they don't leave a guy nothing. Chapter 14. Maera lay still, his head on his arms, his face in the sand. He felt warm and sticky from the bleeding each time he felt the horn coming. Sometimes the bull only bumped him with his head. Once the horn went all the way through him, and he felt it go into the sand. Someone had the bull by the tail. They were swearing at him and flopping the cape in his face. Then the bull was gone. Some men picked Maeda up and started to run with him toward the barriers, through the gate, out to the passageway, around under the grandstand to the infirmary. They laid Maeda down on a cot, and one of the men went out for the doctor. The others stood around. The doctor came running from the corral, where he had been sewing up picador horses. He had to stop and wash his hands. There was a great shouting going on in the grandstand overhead. Maeda felt everything getting larger and larger, and then smaller and smaller. Then it got larger and larger and larger, and then smaller and smaller. Then everything commenced to run faster and faster, as when they speed up a cinematograph film. Then he was dead. Big Two-Hearted River, Part 1. The train went on up the track out of sight around one of the hills of burnt timber. Nick sat down on the bundle of canvas and bedding the baggage man had pitched out of the door of the baggage car. There was no town, nothing but the rails and the burned-over country. Nick sat down on the bundle of canvas and bedding the baggage man had pitched out of the door of the baggage car. There was no town, nothing but the rails and the burned-over country. The 13 saloons that had lined the one street of Seney had not left a trace. The foundations of the Mansion House Hotel stuck up above the ground. The stone was chipped and split by the fire. It was all that was left of the town of Seney. Even the surface had been burned off the ground. Nick looked at the burned-over stretch of hillside where he had expected to find the scattered houses of the town, and then walked down the railroad track to the bridge over the river. The river was there. It swirled against the log spiles of the bridge. Nick looked down into the clear brown water, colored from the pebbly bottom, and watched the trout keeping themselves steady in the current with wavering fins. As he watched them, they changed their positions by quick angles, only to hold steady in the fast water again. Nick watched them a long time. He watched them holding themselves with their noses into the current, many trout in deep, fast-moving water, slightly distorted as he watched far down through the glassy, convex surface of the pool, its surface pushing and swelling smooth against the resistance of the log-driven piles of the bridge. At the bottom of the pool were the big trout. Nick did not see them at first. Then he saw them at the bottom of the pool, big trout, looking to hold themselves on the gravel bottom in a varying mist of gravel and sand raised in spurts by the current. Nick looked down into the pool from the bridge. It was a hot day. A kingfisher flew up the stream. It was a long time since Nick had looked into a stream and seen trout. They were very satisfactory. As the shadow of the kingfisher moved up the stream, a big trout shot upstream in a long angle, only his shadow marking the angle, then lost his shadow as he came through the surface of the water, caught the sun, and then as he went back into the stream under the surface, his shadow seemed to float down the stream with the current, unresisting, to his post under the bridge, where he tightened, facing up into the current. Nick's heart tightened as the trout moved. He felt all the old feeling. He turned and looked down the stream. It stretched away, pebbly-bottomed, with shallows and big boulders, and a deep pool as it curved away around the foot of a bluff. Nick walked back up the ties to where his pack lay in the cinders beside the railway track. He was happy. He adjusted the pack harness around the bundle, pulling straps tight, slung the pack on his back, got his arms through the shoulder straps, and took some of the pull off his shoulders by leaning his forehead against the wide band of the tump line. Still, it was too heavy. It was much too heavy. He had his leather rod case in his hand, and leaning forward to keep the weight of the pack high on his shoulders, he walked along the road that paralleled the railway track, leaving the burned town behind in the heat, and then turned off around a hill with a high, fire-scarred hill on either side, onto a road that went back into the country. He walked along the road, feeling the ache from the pull of the heavy pack. The road climbed steadily. It was hard work walking uphill. His muscles ached, and the day was hot. But Nick felt happy. He felt he had left everything behind. The need for thinking, the need to right other needs. It was all back of him. From the time he had gotten down off the train and the baggage man had thrown his pack out of the open car door, things had been different. Sene was burned. The country was burned over and changed, but it did not matter. It could not all be burned, he knew that. He hiked along the road, sweating in the sun, climbing to cross the range of hills that separated the railway from the pine plains. The road ran on, dipping occasionally, but always climbing. Nick went on up. Finally, the road, after going parallel to the burnt hillside, reached the top. Nick leaned back against a stump and slipped out of the pack harness. Ahead of him, as far as he could see, was the pine plain. The burned country stopped off at the left with the range of hills. On ahead, islands of dark pine trees rose out of the plain. Far off to the left was the line of the river. Nick followed it with his eye and caught glints of the water in the sun. There was nothing but the pine plain ahead of him, until the far blue hills that marked the Lake Superior height of land. He could hardly see them, faint and far away in the heat light over the plain. If he looked too steadily, they were gone. but if he only half looked, they were there, the far-off hills of the height of land. Nick sat down against the charred stump and smoked a cigarette. His pack balanced on the top of the stump, harness holding ready, a hollow molded in it from his back. Nick sat smoking, looking out over the country. He did not need to get his map out. He knew where he was from the position of the river. As he smoked, his legs stretched out in front of him, he noticed a grasshopper walk along the ground and up onto his woolen sock. The grasshopper was black. As he had walked along the road, climbing, he had started many grasshoppers from the dust. They were all black. They were not the big grasshoppers with yellow and black or red and black wings whirring out from their black wing sheathing as they fly up. These were just ordinary hoppers, but all a sooty black in color. Nick had wondered about them as he walked, without really thinking about them. Now, as he watched the black hopper that was nibbling at the wool of his sock with its four-way lip, he realized that they had all turned black from living in the burned-over land. He realized that the fire must have come the year before, but the grasshoppers were all black now. He wondered how long they would stay that way. Carefully, he reached his hand down and took hold of the hopper by the wings. He turned him up, all his legs walking in the air, and looked at his jointed belly. Yes, it was black, too, iridescent where the back and head were dusty. "Go on, Hopper," Nick said, speaking out loud for the first time. "Fly away somewhere." He tossed the grasshopper up into the air and watched him sail away to a charcoal stump across the road. Nick stood up. He leaned his back against the weight of his pack where it rested upright on the stump, and got his arms through the shoulder straps. He stood with the pack on his back on the brow of the hill, looking out across the country toward the distant river, and then struck down the hillside away from the road. Underfoot, the ground was good walking. 200 yards down the hillside, the fire line stopped. Then it was sweet fern, growing ankle-high, to walk through, and clumps of jack pines. A long, undulating country with frequent rises and descents, sandy underfoot, and the country alive again. Nick kept his direction by the sun. He knew where he wanted to strike the river, and he kept on through the pine plain, mounting small rises to see other rises ahead of him, and sometimes, from the top of a rise, a great solid island of pines off to his right or his left. He broke off some sprigs of the heathery sweet fern and put them under his pack straps. The chafing crushed it, and he smelled it as he walked. He was tired and very hot walking across the uneven, shadeless pine plain. At any time he knew he could strike the river by turning off to his left. It could not be more than a mile away, but he kept on toward the north to hit the river as far upstream as he could go in one day's walking. For some time as he walked, Nick had been in sight of one of the big islands of pine standing out above the rolling high ground he was crossing. He dipped down, and then as he came slowly up to the crest of the bridge, he turned and made toward the pine trees. There was no underbrush in the island of pine trees. The trunks of the trees went straight up or slanted toward each other. The trunks were straight and brown, without branches. The branches were high above. Some interlocked to make a solid shadow on the brown forest floor. Around the grove of trees was a bare space. It was brown and soft underfoot as Nick walked on it. This was the overlapping of the pine-needle floor, extending out beyond the width of the high branches. The trees had grown tall, and the branches moved high, leaving in the sun this bare space they had once covered with shadow. Sharp at the edge of this extension of the forest floor commenced the sweet fern. Nick slipped off his pack and lay down in the shade. He lay on his back and looked up into the pine trees. His neck and back and the small of his back rested as he stretched. The earth felt good against his back. He looked up at the sky through the branches and then shut his eyes. He opened them and looked up again. There was a wind high up in the branches. He shut his eyes again and went to sleep. Nick woke stiff and cramped. The sun was nearly down. His pack was heavy, and the straps painful as he lifted it on. He leaned over with the pack on and picked up the leather rod case and started out from the pine trees across the sweet fern swale toward the river. He knew it could not be more than a mile. He came down a hillside covered with stumps into a meadow. At the edge of the meadow flowed the river. Nick was glad to get to the river. He walked upstream through the meadow. His trousers were soaked with the dew as he walked. After the hot day, the dew had come quickly and heavily. The river made no sound. It was too fast and smooth. At the edge of the meadow, before he mounted to a piece of high ground to make camp, Nick looked down the river at the trout rising. They were rising to insects come from the swamp on the other side of the stream when the sun went down. The trout jumped out of water to take them. While Nick walked through the little stretch of meadow alongside the stream, trout had jumped high out of water. Now, as he looked down the river, the insects must be settling on the surface, for the trout were feeding steadily all down the stream. As far down the long stretch as he could see, the trout were rising, making circles all down the surface of the water as though it were starting to rain. The ground rose, wooded and sandy, to overlook the meadow, the stretch of river, and the swamp. Nick dropped his pack and rod case and looked for a level piece of ground. He was very hungry, and he wanted to make his camp before he cooked. Between two jack pines, the ground was quite level. He took the axe out of the pack and chopped out two projecting roots. That leveled a piece of ground large enough to sleep on. He smoothed out the sandy soil with his hand and pulled all the sweet fern bushes by their roots. His hands smelled good from the sweet fern. He smoothed the uprooted earth. He did not want anything making lumps under the blankets. When he had the ground smooth, he spread his 3 blankets. One he folded double next to the ground. The other 2 he spread on top. With the axe, he slit off a bright slab of pine from one of the stumps and split it into pegs for the tent. He wanted them long and solid to hold in the ground. With the tent unpacked and spread on the ground, the pack, leaning against a jack pine, looked much smaller. Nick tied the rope that served the tent for a ridgepole to the trunk of one of the pine trees, and pulled the tent up off the ground with the other end of the rope and tied it to the other pine. The tent hung on the rope like a canvas blanket on a clothesline. Nick poked a pole he had cut up under the back peak of the canvas, and then made it a tent by pegging out the sides. He pegged the sides out taut and drove the pegs deep, hitting them down into the ground with the flat of the axe until the rope loops were buried and the canvas was drum-tight. Across the open mouth of the tent, Nick fixed cheesecloth to keep out mosquitoes. He crawled inside under the mosquito bar with various things from the pack to put at the head of the bed under the slant of the canvas. Inside the tent, the light came through the brown canvas. It smelled pleasantly of canvas. Already there was something mysterious and homelike. Nick was happy as he crawled inside the tent. He had not been unhappy all day. This was different, though. Now things were done. There had been this to do. Now it was done. It had been a hard trip. He was very tired. That was done. He had made his camp. He was settled. Nothing could touch him. It was a good place to camp. He was there in the good place. He was in his home where he had made it. Now he was hungry. He came out crawling under the cheesecloth. It was quite dark outside. It was lighter in the tent. Nick went over to the pack and found with his fingers a long nail in a paper sack of nails in the bottom of the pack. He drove it into the pine tree, holding it close and hitting it gently with the flat of the axe. He hung the pack up on the nail. All his supplies were in the pack. They were off the ground and sheltered now. Nick was hungry. He did not believe he had ever been hungrier. He opened and emptied a can of pork and beans and a can of spaghetti into the frying pan. "I've got a right to eat this kind of stuff if I'm willing to carry it," Nick said. His voice sounded strange in the darkening woods. He did not speak again. He started a fire with some chunks of pine he got with the axe from a stump. Over the fire he stuck a wire grill, pushing the forelegs down into the ground with his boot. Nick put the frying pan on the grill over the flames. He was hungrier. The beans and spaghetti warmed. Nick stirred them and mixed them together. They began to bubble, making little bubbles that rose with difficulty to the surface. There was a good smell. Nick got out a bottle of tomato ketchup and cut 4 slices of bread. The little bubbles were coming faster now. Nick sat down beside the fire and lifted the frying pan off. He poured about half the contents out into the tin plate. It spread slowly on the plate. Nick knew it was too hot. He poured on some tomato ketchup. He knew the beans and spaghetti were still too hot. He looked at the fire, then at the tent. He was not going to spoil it all by burning his tongue. For years he had never enjoyed fried bananas, because he had never been able to wait for them to cool. His tongue was very sensitive. He was very hungry. Across the river in the swamp, in the almost dark, he saw a mist rising. He looked at the tent once more. All right. He took a full spoonful from the plate. "Christ," Nick said. "Jesus Christ," he said happily. He ate the whole plateful before he remembered the bread. Nick finished the second plateful with the bread, mopping the plate shiny. He had not eaten since a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich in the station restaurant at St. Ignace. It had been a very fine experience. He had been that hungry before, but had not been able to satisfy it. He could have made camp hours before if he had wanted to. There were plenty of good places to camp on the river, but this was good. Nick tucked 2 big chips of pine under the grill. The fire flared up. He had forgotten to get water for the coffee. Out of the pack he got a folding canvas bucket and walked down the hill, across the edge of the meadow to the stream. The other bank was in the white mist. The grass was wet and cold as he knelt on the bank and dipped the canvas bucket into the stream. It bellied and pulled hard in the current. The water was ice cold. Nick rinsed the bucket and carried it full up to the camp. Up away from the stream it was not so cold. Nick drove another big nail and hung up the bucket full of water. He dipped the coffee pot half full, put some more chips under the grill onto the fire, and put the pot on. He could not remember which way he made coffee. He could remember an argument about it with Hopkins, but not which side he had taken. He decided to bring it to a boil. He remembered now that was Hopkins' way. He had once argued about everything with Hopkins. While he waited for the coffee to boil, he opened a small can of apricots. He liked to open cans. He emptied the can of apricots out into a tin cup. While he watched the coffee on the fire, he drank the juice syrup of the apricots, carefully at first, to keep from spilling, then meditatively, sucking the apricots down. They were better than fresh apricots. The coffee boiled as he watched. The lid came up, and coffee and grounds ran down the side of the pot. Nick took it off the grill. It was a triumph for Hopkins. He put sugar in the empty apricot cup and poured some of the coffee out to cool. It was too hot to pour, and he used his hat to hold the handle of the coffee pot. He would not let it steep in the pot at all, not the first cup. It should be straight Hopkins all the way. Hop deserved that. He was a very serious coffee drinker. He was the most serious man Nick had ever known. Not heavy, serious. That was a long time ago. Hopkins spoke without moving his lips. He had played polo. He made millions of dollars in Texas. He had borrowed car fare to go to Chicago when the wire came that his first big well had come in. He could have wired for money. That would have been too slow. They called Hop's girl the Blonde Venus. Hop did not mind, because she was not his real girl. Hopkins said very confidently that none of them would make fun of his real girl. He was right. Hopkins went away when the telegram came. That was on the Black River. It took 8 days for the telegram to reach him. Hopkins gave away his .22 caliber Colt automatic pistol to Nick. He gave his camera to Bill. It was to remember him always by. They were all going fishing again next summer. The hophead was rich. He would get a yacht, and they would all cruise along the north shore of Lake Superior. He was excited, but serious. They said goodbye, and all felt bad. It broke up the trip. They never saw Hopkins again. That was a long time ago on the Black River. Nick drank the coffee according to Hopkins. The coffee was bitter. Nick laughed. It made a good ending to the story. His mind was starting to work. He knew he could choke it because he was tired enough. He spilled the coffee out of the pot and shook the grounds loose into the fire. He lit a cigarette and went inside the tent. He took off his shoes and trousers, sitting on the blankets, rolled the shoes up inside the trousers for a pillow, and got in between the blankets. Out through the front of the tent he watched the glow of the fire when the night wind blew on it. It was a quiet night. The swamp was perfectly quiet. Nick stretched under the blanket comfortably. A mosquito hummed close to his ear. Nick sat up and lit a match. The mosquito was on the canvas over his head. Nick moved the match quickly up to it. The mosquito made a satisfactory hiss in the flame. The match went out. Nick lay down again under the blanket. He turned on his side and shut his eyes. He was sleepy. He felt sleep coming. He curled up under the blanket and went to sleep. Chapter 15. They hanged Sam Cardinella at 6 o'clock in the morning in the corridor of the county jail. The corridor was high and narrow, with tiers of cells on either side. All the cells were occupied. The men had been brought in for the hanging. 5 men sentenced to be hanged were in the 5 top cells. 3 of the men to be hanged were Negroes. They were very frightened. One of the white men sat on his cot with his head in his hands. The other lay flat on his cot with a blanket wrapped around his head. They came out onto the gallows through a door in the wall. There were 7 of them, including 2 priests. They were carrying Sam Cardinella. He had been like that since about 4 o'clock in the morning. While they were strapping his legs together, 2 guards held him up, and the 2 priests were whispering to him. "Be a man, my son," said one priest. When they came toward him with the cap to go over his head, Sam Cardinella lost control of his sphincter muscle. The guards who had been holding him up both dropped him. They were both disgusted. "How about a chair, Will?" asked one of the guards. "Better get one," said a man in a derby hat. When they all stepped back on the scaffolding, back of the drop, which was very heavy, built of oak and steel, and swung on ball bearings, Sam Cardinella was left sitting there, strapped tight, the younger of the 2 priests kneeling beside the chair. The priest skipped back onto the scaffolding just before the drop fell. Big Two-Hearted River, Part 2. In the morning the sun was up, and the tent was starting to get hot. Nick crawled out under the mosquito netting, stretched across the mouth of the tent to look at the morning. The grass was wet on his hands as he came out. He held his trousers and his shoes in his hands. The sun was just up over the hill. There was the meadow, the river, and the swamp. There were birch trees in the green of the swamp on the other side of the river. The river was clear and smoothly fast in the early morning. Down about 200 yards were 3 logs all the way across the stream. They made the water smooth and deep above them. As Nick watched, a mink crossed the river on the logs and went into the swamp. Nick was excited. He was excited by the early morning and the river. He was really too hurried to eat breakfast, but he knew he must. He built a little fire and put on the coffee pot. While the water was heating in the pot, he took an empty bottle and went down over the edge of the high ground to the meadow. The meadow was wet with dew, and Nick wanted to catch grasshoppers for bait before the sun dried the grass. He found plenty of good grasshoppers. They were at the base of the grass stems. Sometimes they clung to a grass stem. They were cold and wet with the dew and could not jump until the sun warmed them. Nick picked them up, taking only the medium-sized brown ones, and put them into the bottle. He turned over a log, and just under the shelter of the edge were several hundred hoppers. It was a grasshopper lodging house. Nick put about 50 of the medium browns into the bottle. While he was picking up the hoppers, the others warmed in the sun and commenced to hop away. They flew when they hopped. At first they made one flight and stayed stiff when they landed, as though they were dead. Nick knew that by the time he was through with breakfast they would be as lively as ever. Without dew in the grass, it would take him all day to catch a bottle full of good grasshoppers, and he would have to crush many of them, slamming at them with his hat. He washed his hands at the stream. He was excited to be near it. Then he walked up to the tent. The hoppers were already jumping stiffly in the grass. In the bottle, warmed by the sun, they were jumping in a mass. Nick put in a pine stick as a cork. It plugged the mouth of the bottle enough so the hoppers could not get out and left plenty of air passage. He had rolled the log back and knew he could get grasshoppers there every morning. Nick laid the bottle full of jumping grasshoppers against a pine trunk. Rapidly he mixed some buckwheat flour with water and stirred it smooth, 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of water. He put a handful of coffee in the pot and dipped a lump of grease out of a can and slid it sputtering across the hot skillet. On the smoking skillet he poured smoothly the buckwheat batter. It spread like lava, the grease spitting sharply. Around the edges the buckwheat cake began to firm, then brown, then crisp. The surface was bubbling slowly to porousness. Nick pushed under the browned-under surface with a fresh pine chip. He shook the skillet sideways, and the cake was loose on the surface. "I won't try and flop it," he thought. He slid the chip of clean wood all the way under the cake and flopped it over onto its face. It sputtered in the pan. When it was cooked, Nick re-greased the skillet. He used all the batter. It made another big flapjack and 1 smaller one. Nick ate a big flapjack and a smaller one, covered with apple butter. He put apple butter on the 3rd cake, folded it over twice, wrapped it in oiled paper, and put it in his shirt pocket. He put the apple butter jar back in the pack and cut bread for 2 sandwiches. In the pack he found a big onion. He sliced it in 2 and peeled the silky outer skin. Then he cut 1/2 into slices and made onion sandwiches. He wrapped them in oiled paper and buttoned them in the other pocket of his khaki shirt. He turned the skillet upside down on the grill, drank the coffee, sweetened and yellow-brown with the condensed milk in it, and tidied up the camp. It was a good camp. Nick took his fly rod out of the leather rod case, jointed it, and shoved the rod case back into the tent. He put on the reel and threaded the line through the guides. He had to hold it from hand to hand as he threaded it, or it would slip back through its own weight. It was a heavy, double-tapered fly line. Nick had paid $8 for it a long time ago. It was made heavy to lift back in the air and come forward flat and heavy and straight to make it possible to cast a fly which has no weight. Nick opened the aluminum leader box. The leaders were coiled between the damp flannel pads. Nick had wet the pads at the water cooler on the train up to St. Ignace. In the damp pads the gut leaders had softened, and Nick unrolled one and tied it by a loop at the end to the heavy fly line. He fastened a hook on the end of the leader. It was a small hook, very thin and springy. Nick took it from his hook book. Sitting with the rod across his lap, he tested the knot and the spring of the rod by pulling the line taut. It was a good feeling. He was careful not to let the hook bite into his finger. He started down to the stream, holding his rod. The bottle of grasshoppers hung from his neck by a thong, tied in half hitches around the neck of the bottle. His landing net hung by a hook from his belt. Over his shoulder was a long flour sack, tied at each corner into an ear. The cord went over his shoulder. The sack flapped against his legs. Nick felt awkward and professionally happy with all his equipment hanging from him. The grasshopper bottle swung against his chest. In his shirt the breast pockets bulged against him with the lunch and his fly book. He stepped into the stream. It was a shock. His trousers clung tight to his legs. His shoes felt the gravel. The water was a rising cold shock. Rushing, the current sucked against his legs.
Where he stepped in, the water was over his knees. He waded with the current. The gravel slid under his shoes. He looked down at the swirl of water below each leg and tipped up the bottle to get a grasshopper. The first grasshopper gave a jump in the neck of the bottle and went out into the water. He was sucked under in the whirl by Nick's right leg and came to the surface a little way downstream. He floated rapidly, kicking. In a quick circle, breaking the smooth surface of the water, he disappeared. A trout had taken him. Another hopper poked his face out of the bottle. His antennae wavered. He was getting his front legs out of the bottle to jump. Nick took him by the head and held him while he threaded the slim hook under his chin, down through his thorax, into the last segments of his abdomen. The grasshopper took hold of the hook with its front feet, spitting tobacco juice on it. Nick dropped him into the water. Holding the rod in his right hand, he let out line against the pull of the grasshopper in the current. He stripped off line from the reel with his left hand and let it run free. He could see the hopper in the little waves of the current. It went out of sight. There was a tug on the line. Nick pulled against the taut line. It was his first strike. Holding the now living rod across the current, he brought in the line with his left hand. The rod bent in jerks, the trout pumping against the current. Nick knew it was a small one. He lifted the rod straight up in the air. It bowed with the pull. He saw the trout in the water, jerking with his head and body against the shifting tangent of the line in the stream. Nick took the line in his left hand and pulled the trout, thumping tiredly against the current, to the surface. His back was mottled, the clear water-over-gravel color, his side flashing in the sun. The rod under his right arm, Nick stooped, dipping his right hand into the current. He held the trout, never still, with his moist right hand, while he unhooked the barb from his mouth, then dropped him back into the stream. He hung unsteadily in the current, then settled to the bottom beside a stone. Nick reached down his hand to touch him, his arm to the elbow under water. The trout was steady in the moving stream, resting on the gravel beside a stone. As Nick's fingers touched him, touched his smooth, cool underwater feeling, he was gone. Gone in a shadow across the bottom of the stream. He's all right, Nick thought. He was only tired. He had wet his hand before he touched the trout so he would not disturb the delicate mucus that covered him. If a trout was touched with a dry hand, a white fungus attacked the unprotected spot. Years before, when he had fished crowded streams with fly fishermen ahead of him and behind him, Nick had again and again come on dead trout, furry with white fungus, drifted against a rock, or floating belly up in some pool. Nick did not like to fish with other men on the river. Unless they were of your party, they spoiled it. He wallowed down the stream above his knees in the current, through the 50 yards of shallow water above the pile of logs that crossed the stream. He did not rebait his hook and held it in his hand as he waded. He was certain he could catch small trout in the shallows, but he did not want them. There would be no big trout in the shallows this time of day. Now the water deepened up his thighs, sharply and coldly. Ahead was the smooth, dammed-back flood of water above the logs. The water was smooth and dark. On the left, the lower edge of the meadow. On the right, the swamp. Nick leaned back against the current and took a hopper from the bottle. He threaded the hopper on the hook and spat on him for good luck. Then he pulled several yards of line from the reel and tossed the hopper out ahead onto the fast, dark water. It floated down towards the logs, then the weight of the line pulled the bait under the surface. Nick held the rod in his right hand, letting the line run out through his fingers. There was a long tug. Nick struck, and the rod came alive and dangerous, bent double, the line tightening, coming out of water, tightening, all in a heavy, dangerous, steady pull. Nick felt the moment when the leader would break if the strain increased and let the line go. The reel ratcheted into a mechanical shriek as the line went out in a rush. Too fast. Nick could not check it. The line rushing out, the reel note rising as the line ran out. With the core of the reel showing, his heart feeling stopped with the excitement, leaning back against the current that mounted icily his thighs, Nick thumbed the reel hard with his left hand. It was awkward getting his thumb inside the fly-reel frame. As he put on pressure, the line tightened into sudden hardness, and beyond the logs a huge trout went high out of water. As he jumped, Nick lowered the tip of the rod, but he felt as he dropped the tip to ease the strain, the moment when the strain was too great, the hardness too tight. Of course the leader had broken. There was no mistaking the feeling when all spring left the line and it became dry and hard. Then it went slack. His mouth dry, his heart down, Nick reeled in. He had never seen so big a trout. There was a heaviness, a power not to be held, and then the bulk of him as he jumped. He looked as broad as a salmon. Nick's hand was shaky. He reeled in slowly. The thrill had been too much. He felt vaguely a little sick, as though it would be better to sit down.